All right, can everyone hear me? Or do I have to get close? So when I submitted my title for my keynote address, I titled it, "Do You See What I See? Can You? Contemporary Worldview and Perspective Through the Eyes of an Indigenous Poet and Scholar." And I can't see what I saw when I wrote that topic as classic anthropologist, overly complicated yet vague title. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is empathy in politics. Living as an Indigenous person, as a Mi'kmaq woman, as Ilnu, is an inherently political act, given our histories. From speaking our languages, to wearing our braids, to dancing and drumming, to national inquiries into missing and murdered Indigenous women, is all political because of how our histories and how we are governed. Canada has created a system that has historically disadvantaged and assimilated us. And yet, in spite of all of this, we still continue to survive and to thrive. It's always beautiful hearing the language. I don't speak Mi'kmaq. My dad is a residential school survivor. And so when I hear it, it always warms my heart. So I'm going to talk about a lot of different things. And they might seem disconnected, but trust me when I tell you that each topic is simply a thread in a web that has First Nations and other Indigenous people caught at the center. You can't look at one without shaking the entire web. So to begin, as I said, the very nature of our existence, we are political beings. And a lot of the world doesn't necessarily take kindly to our unique status as First People. I'm not a dancer, I'm not a drummer, and I'm most definitely not a singer. I like to think of myself as a storyteller. I use my poems to tell a story of how I see the world. I also wrote a thesis, but nobody wants to read 127 pages from a 25-year-old know-it-all. So instead, I write poetry, and it's a little bit more easy to digest. And when I did my thesis, I'll totally admit that it was a completely selfish endeavor to see where I fit within the world of Indigenous relations. I grew up off reserve. I knew I was different, but I didn't really know what that meant. When I was 14 years old, I experienced my first ever overt racism. I was in math class, and my teacher was pairing us all up for an assignment. He was saying things like Christy and Sean, and Jimmy and Annika, and Rebecca and Brett. And when he got to me and Brett exclaims to the entire class, "I'm not going to work with no Indian." I was so embarrassed. I was so ashamed. And I was really angry. And I felt something that at 14 years old, I wasn't able to articulate. It might have been the first time I had experienced racism in my life, but it was also the first time that somebody else had labeled me as other. Here's the thing. I didn't feel other. I was Rebecca. So it was a massive shift in my worldview. I realized that I was being told that I was something else, contrary to what I had always experienced and grew up with. I can't quite find the words to describe that feeling, but I can essentially say that it definitely kicked off a long journey of trying to figure out where I fit and what my struggles with my identity was. And over the course of my short life, I went from being Rebecca, whose father was Native, to being told that I was an Indian, to tentatively teasing out that my dad was Micmac, to feeling like a fraud as I checked the Aboriginal box, to learning about my father's experience in residential schools, to identifying as Mi'kmaq, to feeling Mi'kmaq, and then to feeling like I belonged in an Indigenous community. And even now, as I stand here today, I have to hype myself up. I get nervous in ceremony because I feel like I'm going to be called out as a fake, that I'm doing something wrong or incorrectly. How unfortunate is that? The fact that we have internalized all of these histories of colonialism, that at the end of the day, I'm afraid of being a bad Mi'kmaq. So to begin my extended talk, you're going to hear the beginnings of my poetry. And I cringe when I read this because it was the first poem that I ever wrote in this kind of realm, but I think it's really important to set the tone because we all began somewhere. Being Indigenous is a lived experience. It doesn't come down to blood quantum or whether or not you're a 6'1" or a 6'2", or you're non-status, or you have blue eyes, or you have brown eyes. It's being a lived experience, and it takes time to be able to live that experience, especially if you were removed from it from such a young age. So this poem is called Sweetgrass in the City. And again, to hype myself up, because if you ever look back at some of the things you wrote in undergrad, or you go, so I promise they get better from here. My father attended a school where violence was the only tool. Children who practiced their culture were preyed on by vultures. They were hit and kicked, lived through religious spit by figureheads who believed they were helping. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the mantra of the day. And being Indian, well, being an Indian was a crime just to say. Schools turned out batches of apples who could vote in exchange for their spirits, and I don't want to hear it, why the public won't go near it, because the truth is so hard that the whole country fears it. So for my people, I won't budge, because the dependence on drugs has replaced the sacred smell of a smudge. But their laughter was too strong and their tears too plain that they washed away their pain. They bathed in the resilience of a people who refused to be broken. And just because my language isn't spoken by me does not mean that it's gone or dismissed. Like my auntie would say, namultis means see you later, alligator, only to return to my lips like a lover's long-lost kiss. But I straighten my hair because I still really care what the res world thinks of me, because I was once told sweetgrass doesn't grow in the city. And I'm going to admit that trying to be Mi'kmaq is the pits, when really I just have to see it's already a part of me and to relax and just be, because the moment I move it and try to prove it, my confidence is shaken, leaving my beating heart aching. But I'm bleeding, seed beating, just needing my bannock, my bread, and it's all in my head, so I'll take my eel weirs, change my gears, and I know that my culture cannot be held in arrears. I'll hold my head high, dust off my mocks, slip them over my socks, and let the drumbeat fill me with pride, eagle feather by my side. I'm stepping into a world where I don't really fit, but I can no longer wait for it to see me. I'll never stop trying, because it is better than lying or dying. I will always be vying. I may not be perfect, and I've yet all to learn it, but world, you can keep your pity, because I am living proof that sweetgrass does indeed grow in the city. Thank you. You're very kind. Thank you. Now here's the thing. I sometimes still feel the need to justify who I am as Mi'kmaq because of those internalized spectrum of nativeness that we have adopted and that I've alluded to. Now, I don't expect many of you to be avid TEDx talk watchers, but I alluded this to my own talk. We as Indigenous people, at least many of us, I still don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of an entire nation or a country of people, have this notion that there are those who are the most Native, and there are those that are the least Native. The most Natives are the people who are drummers and singers and dancers and speakers, have dark hair, straight hair, dark eyes, brown skin, live on reserve, etc. And then from there, as you lose these defining features, your nativeness is somehow less valid. There is a cognitive or logistic disconnect that the reason I don't speak Mi'kmaq with any fluency or live on reserve is because my lineage was so native that it needed to be assimilated, eliminated, and erased because it was a threat to the colonial powers that be. My father, as I said, is a residential school survivor, and if we're going to use arbitrary tools of measurement and milestones, it really doesn't get any more Mi'kmaq than that. Many of us live and die by our status cards, when in reality, status cards are essentially a tool to control and limit access to treaty rights for Indigenous peoples. I have a status card. I have a band number. I also have an expiration date on my indigeneity. So to give you an example, I had my post-secondary, for the most part, fully funded. In order for my funding to come through, I had to have a valid status card. My status card expires every 10 years. It is a legal classification, a designation by the Indian Act, a document that is over 150 years old that governs the Indigenous people of this land, what some might call an apartheid. And that because my father was Indigenous and my mother was not, that allowed me to pass on my status. Because of that, I am a 6-1 in my classification. Had the ethnicities of my parents been reversed, I might not have status had my mother never reapplied for it in the first place, and I wouldn't be able to pass on my status unless I either applied through Bill C-3, which came in 2011, 26 years after Bill C-31. And if you are confused, imagine what it's like for a person who hasn't been in this realm for the last 10 years, who haven't researched it, who haven't read all of these legal documents, who live in a community that doesn't have access to, Service Canada, nearby, who doesn't have a car, who doesn't necessarily have a credit card to write down and to pay for the $90 application for a status card, right? So, my question to you, is that a step in the direction of reconciliation? In all of my Poet Laureate glory, this will be the only time that I swear in this presentation, but the only words that come to mind is "that's fucked up." Because it's true. Like I said, I have an extensive education in socio-historical and political relations between Canada and the First Peoples of this land, and like I said, I still find it complicated to navigate. Now, my title and my clout and my education puts me in a dangerous and very privileged position. And the whole point of this talk is just to give you perspective, is just to shift your paradigm just a little bit. I am constantly looked to as the expert on Indigenous issues, whether it's at my job at the Nova Scotia Community College, whether it is CBC Main Street calling me up to weigh in on a story. But I am just one woman from one nation who grew up off reserve, who does not speak her language, who has a very, very different worldview and experience of what it means to be an Indigenous person. So at this moment, when you meet an Indigenous person who is well educated, recognize that they are limited in what they know. For the non-Native people here, if I were to ask you for the intricate breakdowns of every single city, town across Canada, and then you falter in telling me who the mayor of Lethbridge is, I'm not going to fault you for that. So I ask that you use the same perspective and understand that what I say is just one facet of the truth, and to take that with a grain of salt. So enter my next poem. I work in education. I work with Indigenous post-secondary students. I was an Indigenous post-secondary student. And what I can say is that it is tragic how often Indigenous students have to defend their right to be in the classroom. Now, my students are lucky enough to have the Poet Laureate in their corner. So this piece draws criticism to what they experience, but it's centered on me because I'm a grown-up and I can handle the criticism. But I have had students in tears in my office saying that when they walk through the classroom, people look at them funny. When they come into my classroom, they say, this is the only place where I feel like I can breathe, right? So I address that in a poem. Be sure to diversify your pieces. You wouldn't want to be pigeonholed as the native poet. So it was said to me and me to myself in my constant self-doubt that after a while my passion for my people would fall on deaf ears and rolled eyes. The following, a taste of why I will never give in on hustling my allies. Every word is something I've witnessed, read, or heard. So I ask that you listen before you tell me what I say is absurd. Here we go again, they'll say to themselves. She's probably going to talk about water quality and mental health, 20 years of boil orders in contaminated wells, or 140 attempts in 2 weeks to kill themselves. But if you live on reserve, chief and council will give you a free house, so it can't be that bad, though we took status away from your spouse as a tax-paying citizen. I don't believe we should continue to support them. So what if we spend $4,000 less each year on every one of their children? Because the young and white are the new post-secondary victim, a Affirmative action and designated seats are taking away opportunity from the country's elite. I worked hard to get where I am. With no help from charity, achievement should be based purely on a meritocracy. Because the halls were full of people who looked like me, I must have been outstanding to earn my degree. And I can't even express my opinions in the comments on the CBC because everyone is too concerned with being PC. So you can see why my frustration can push me to the other side of angry. History's voice is color-coded by those who have always had the right to vote for it. Do you know what it's like to only see yourself as appropriated? To see Karlie Kloss wearing a headdress on the runway half naked, being told that spray-painted racial slurs on homes in Nova Scotia are isolated? Your ignorance is showing if you think colonialism is over and outdated by the egregious fact that I need a government-issued card that proves that I'm Native. A card requiring birth certificates, photographs, guarantors to be validated, a card that expires every 10 years. Point me to a colonizer whose ethnicity can be held in arrears. I would like to read the Federal White Act. I'd like to see your equivalent to e-tags and a res pass. Maybe live in a city founded by a man who put a bounty on your scalps. On the corner of Cornwallis Street is where our friendship center is housed. Did you ever stop and think why we are called the Redskins? It's because we rubbed ourselves raw trying to scrub off the moniker of dirty Indian. Trudeau is great and all, but statistically I am still 5 times more likely to go missing. Justin, that Haida tattoo is cute, but you've got to sit down and listen. It's time to get this country in a treaty condition. And you can all suck your teeth and roll your eyes. But I am simply not ready to diversify my writing and go with it because I am proud to be pigeonholed as the Native poet. Thank you. And I've had enough of these heels, I can tell you that much. So I've found the fire, so to speak. But more importantly, how can the non-Indigenous people here today work towards reconciliation? What is meaningful reconciliation? Is it a series of checked boxes, a forced apology with a handful of Indigenous people in a space that symbolizes the power of the oppressor? Is it reports, recommendations? Does calling them calls to action mean more? What about payouts? There's something called a common experience payment that residential school survivors got. Essentially, it was an algorithm that would take into account how long you were at residential school, how young you were when you went in, what sort of abuse you suffered. Certain abuses, had higher dollar amounts associated to them. So sexual and physical abuse would get you more money than other kinds. And then they would pump this into a formula and then give you a dollar amount on the other end. Now, my father received several $1,000s. More than 12, less than 20. I'm not sure the exact amount. Now, my dad, up until I was 15, struggled with alcohol. He had just beaten alcoholism, or entered recovery for the last time, when he was issued this check. And he told me, if you had given me this check last year while I was still drinking, it would have been gone. Right? And even still, even after he, as a very lucky person, because if you look at the statistics on alcoholism, the people who beat it and the people who don't are far fewer. It took him over a year to cash that check. Because for him, to cash in that check meant that his childhood and his language and his culture and his relationship with his community and his relationship to his elders and to his children and his siblings was worth more than $12,000, but less than 20. And by cashing it in, said, we're good. Now, the TRC has done fabulous work, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Many survivors felt like they could speak for the very first time about the schools at these summits because they felt like somebody wanted to hear what they had to say. But the problem with the TRC and other such official things is that when something official wraps up There is a sense of completeness. It implies that we are finished. And in that particular project, that we're reconciled. So you know I have a poem about that. It's called Reconcile Your State of Mind. As a nation, we have missed our mark by one hell of a mile. For the history that defiled my father's culture when he was just a child, to the society that exotifies our braided hairstyles, to the public that buries their heads in the sand piles, whose finger-pointing reviles our chiefs and beliefs can breathe easy. Because as of 2015, we are reconciled, which means we're no longer judged, and a Dakota child won't be sent home for the fact that he smudged because he found his brother cold when touched. And there is no grudge against the fact that sometimes I get tax-free gas, but only in pre-approved monitored amounts. I wouldn't want to be brash with the spending of my government-given cash. We have accepted the norm of more natives in prison, unable to forgive them for the traumas they've suffered, content to maintain a buffer between reality and comfort. Our biased history spun to finally deal with the Indigenous conundrum. I can't help but wonder what life was like back in 1491, and we have come to terms with the panic in my father's eyes when he reads the Apology of Lies, his sobriety uncompromised, taking time to exorcise the demons that swirl in his soul, the one that was saved and placed into the hole left by the loss of his language. But at least he's got $3,000 in education credits to sandwich his time in lieu between now and the years he spent in residential schools. Dad, I have been practicing Gesulu. I'm sorry if this reference is so tensile. I'm working my way through the stages of grief, still caught in denial that I nearly forgot. We are reconciled. The highway of tears, girl, that was so last year. No need to fear that you'll be snatched or attacked because it's a fact. We are reconciled. Now, may I be so bold as to make a suggestion? Instead of a budget and a timeline for reconciliation, how about an accurate portrayal of history in our nation's education? Bring back the National Aboriginal Health Organization, institute classes for language reclamation, question why there are so many Aboriginals in incarceration, or at least develop a strategy for suicide prevention because we kill ourselves up to 11 times more often. And if we had one, Dakota kids wouldn't have to see their little brothers in coffins, and to soften the lines in the sand that we all tend to draw and eliminate common words like redskin and squaw. I've washed my hands of this so many times at the raw, but I can't shake the frustration that we are still referred to as Indians under the law. But worry not, take off my shoes, no need to walk that mile. Because Canada has spent enough money, checked all the right boxes, all of our accounts have been compiled, our perks and benefits beguiled. Congratulations, Canada, you have finally reconciled this nation's state of mind so that in the face of our suffering, you will always turn a blind eye. Thank you. I know the poems start getting like realer and realer as I go. So I'm going to make you all feel awful by the end of this talk. It's still very apparent that we have a long, long way to go with regards to reconciliation. We have no choice. We're the fastest growing demographic in Canada. Our median age is 27 years old compared to that of 43 for the rest of the Canadian population. In the future, there will be more of us in your workplaces, your classrooms, your public spaces. The world is going to have to learn to interact with us in ways that are much more meaningful than it ever has in the past. How the public how we are viewed by the public has immeasurable effects on our population. The American Psychological Association has demanded the retirement of the Washington logo, saying that it elicits psychological distress and low self-esteem in Indigenous youth. This is further compounded by the justification that these names or images are vintage or that they honor the legacy of a strong people. Now, I was unsure whether or not to perform this next piece, but it's my keynote and I'm Poet Laureate and I'll do what I want. So here we go. My name is Swift Fox, proud member of the Mi'kmaq Nation of Mi'kma'ki, the Wabanaki, a people of the dawn with a legacy 12,000 years long, and I am honored. I am honored with overpriced beer and shitty hot dogs, by juiced up ball players and abusive running backs, by packs of fans packed into stands doing the tomahawk chop. In 2013, a Philadelphia Eagles fan was photographed, impaled on his staff. Crass and crude was the mocked-up head of an Indigenous man, and I was honored. In his grasp, a perfect pictorial of postmodern cultural appropriation and genocide, the public perception made perfectly clear the head of a dead Indian in one hand and in the other a beer. Daughter of a survivor and keeper of my family's culture, I listen to my elders, I know my teachings, my beliefs, I stand tall against the culture thieves, yet time and time again I am told our leadership is not being disrespected by the KC chiefs because I am honored. We are caricatures, mascots to amuse you with ridiculous parallels to draw to, like the realest Indian on the block, Chief Wahoo, ancient mythical creatures entombed in lieu of respect, our confidence wrecked by bisected public scrutiny between judgment of too much sensitivity and contempt for perceived easy corruptibility, and so I am honored. I'm saving my favorite for last, the epitome of my righteous Indigenous wrath, the Washington professional football team, whose name is the IV morphine to the politically correct, beaten and battered, ignorant majority. A team name that is such an obvious racial slur. A team name that you'll have to concur is literally colorblind. Because when it's all done and said, I'm really more brown than I have ever been red. A team name that alienates, isolates, racially perpetuates our inferior status. A team name whose trademark no longer has a basis because even American copyright officers know that it's racist. A team name that will never pass these lips or cross my cutting tongue unless it's to cut its supporters down by several rungs, because I am honored. I am honored by the eagle feather that was given to me upon the completion of my master's degree. I am honored by the hysterical laughter of my nephew sitting on my knee. I am honored by my father's 15 years of sobriety for a national inquiry and the right to marry a non-native man without the world questioning my indigeneity. But I am just one person. So, take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. I want my cultural pride back, but the world won't cut me some slack, and it's rigged, rigged, rigged for the home team. Somehow we're always to blame, because it's privilege that makes all the rules in the honor game. Thank you. Now, our images have been appropriated and used, but what happens when it is no longer our images, but our lives that are at stake? Just a week or so ago, a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women was launched. We had demanded for a very long time, and it took an entirely different government to launch one. The previous Prime Minister having said that it was a crime issue and not a sociological issue. How can we believe that sort of statement when a person only needs to scroll to the comment section to see a snapshot of public opinion? I know this doesn't represent all people. The mere exercise of seeking out an alternative news site because others had disallowed public comments on Indigenous stories speaks volumes. Unfortunately, I found a mainstream site that still allows comments on Indigenous stories. If you linked your Facebook page. So the following are a few real comments from real people, and I will not say their real names, but I want to point out that I could not find a single comment defending the inquiry. It was either hatred, disdain, or pity. Quote, if those in institutions are found negligent or not punished under the law, this commission is just another useless public relations gimmick. Quote, and when it's all over, how much money are the so-called First Nations going to want this time? Quote, the question has to be asked why so many Indigenous girls and women leave their communities in the first place. Is it possible that they are abused so badly by the males in their extended family that they have no choice other than to stay and live with the abuse or commit suicide? Perhaps this is one reason they become victims of drugs and alcohol. Quote, Indigenous communities have many problems, not all of which can be put on Canada, and the blame has to be borne by the lifestyles and the cultures of the First Nations. Quote, this whole thing is a farce. Sticks and stones may break our bones, but it is the legacy of colonialism that throws them. I know many of you are probably shocked and disgusted by these comments, and I know some of you probably shake your head because it's not the first time you've heard things like this. Remember that these are people who could not comment anonymously given the rules of the site, yet they still felt safe enough in their privilege to make these remarks. Their ignorance is staggering. One of the comments is laughable, that said, quote, "If we don't like living in Canada, we should go back to where we came from." That's not a joke, that was a real comment. And that ignorance can wreak havoc on our self-esteem, as I mentioned with the sports logo. The way our women and the way because I am the demographic that they speak of, Indigenous women, it reduces us to unfortunate calamities and objects that are somehow at fault for what has happened to them. I want you all to think for a moment. How many of you at some point in your life did something that wasn't the smartest or the best decision? You drank too much, you got into a car you shouldn't have, wandered off with a stranger, hitchhiked. We know now that it was a bad decision, but at the time you probably think it was worthwhile. And if any of you were the victim of a terrible circumstance, in that moment, how many of you blamed yourself for what was happening to you? So I'm asking many of you, if this were a more kind of diverse audience, to suspend your disbelief when I say that we have never asked to be marginalized. We have never asked for decades-long boil orders. We have never asked for a 2% funding cap. We have never asked for substandard housing. We have never asked to go murdered and missing. We never asked for the Indian Act. We never asked for colonization. The media drags these women through the dirt by publishing details of drug abuse or prostitution to justify why she deserved it. At what point did it become acceptable to blame the missing or the murdered woman because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or she put herself at risk, instead of blaming the person who hurt her? In my mind, it's the same messed up logic we use when we tell young university women to watch their drinks while they're out at the bar, instead of teaching young university men to not put things into women's drinks. We have somehow wound up in a place where the victim shoulders some, if not all, of the blame, and yet when it comes to Indigenous women, society doubles down by taking the image of Indigenous women, consuming it through appropriation of style and aesthetic, and then casting aside our women, both literally and figuratively. If this is sobering, it's because it's meant to be, and with that in mind, here's my next piece entitled Pennies. Girl, she slays with those double braids. She is slayed because of those double braids. The original voice silenced from those double braids. They can be bought and sold, those double braids. In fact, there's a sale at the bay for those double braids. Look for the HBC original canoe for your half-off Canadian branded series of snowshoes. Erase the creators of those goods. Their origin and history have no need to be understood. Use them for your favorite winter activities, like lightly frolicking over her forgotten snow-covered body. It's buy one, get one misrepresentations of her story. Just look for the nearest store occupying our territory. Check the back of your status cards for the special pin to activate the coupons that include free judgment to go along with the perceived sin that what she got, she had coming. And if she goes missing, have her family bring in the newspaper clipping. Show it at the register for their discounted black suits, dresses, and other dark labels. It's a quality purchase that can be worn over and over again as a funeral staple. Given the current societal climate, they'll get plenty of wear out of this product. Like last year's fashion, it's so easy to forget her. Just toss her remains in Manitoba's aptly named Red River. The vitriol comes free with purchase if she had some form of mental illness. It's a points card full of expert witness that would be remiss if he didn't remind us that she was at risk because she happened to choose to be in the prostitution business. You'll find the apathy on the shelf next to the ceremonial music festival headdresses. After every 10 biased news stories, you'll get a free personal allegory of a guy who knows a guy who dated a native girl because he doesn't see color and is well-read, who wants a gold star because he went to a powwow once and totally listens to A Tribe Called Red. I'd say their names, but there are far too many. We are the forgotten Canadian penny, our coppery skin removed from circulation over time because it isn't as valued as the lighter dimes. It's 10 for 1. son, what a deal. Just like our land, we come at a steal. Her body's a commodity bought and sold as prepackaged native spirituality. Sorry, we don't sell an empowered Indigenous matriarchy, but we carry exotified Indians included with batteries. Her life's receipt is marked final sale. There are no refunds on colonization retail. It's a Black Friday special with tax exemption. Our culture turned boho style consumption. Keep beating those drums for social redemption. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get positive media attention. APTN coverage of a sunrise ceremony on a red morning because the red are mourning. The double braids found 90% off in the bargain box. We don't know where they came from because the tags were ripped off. Thank you. So I have talked about residential schools and identity, and I have talked about missing and murdered Indigenous women and colonialism, and it might seem scattered to you, but it isn't to me. All of these things do not exist separate from one another. They are strongly tied in what it means to be Indigenous in 2016. When I spoke about how being Indigenous is an inherently political act, I'm hoping that you are beginning to see why. We are making progress. Here in Mi'kma'ki, we have the highest number of high school graduates of any First Nation in Canada. We're sitting close to 90%. That's almost higher than the national average. We have more and more PhDs, Indigenous PhDs graduating every year. UBC graduated the most Indigenous PhDs that they ever have this year. We have more doctors and lawyers and those with higher education, but we still have abysmal living conditions. High rates of illness and mortality, the highest rates of suicide, and still very high dropout rates. It takes time to come back from centuries of being told that we weren't good at anything. Furthermore, there's the added pressure from the public and media that feels as though we aren't doing a good enough job and that somehow we get benefits by who we are. But there are benefits. There are benefits to our knowledge. One of the best chemotherapy drugs for breast cancer comes from the inside of a specific tree bark found on the eastern seaboard. This was discovered using traditional Indigenous knowledges. The Inuit in the north noticed effects of climate change decades before scientists knew what was happening or what to call it because of their connection to the land and their understanding of seasons and cycles. Universal design for learning in post-secondary classroom and the strategies are rooted in Indigenous pedagogy. When seeking solutions for colonially induced problems that plague our communities, may I suggest a radical idea? Perhaps ask us what should be done. And more importantly, believe us when we make a suggestion. We are the experts on us. But here's the thing. There are parallel contexts that exist and can complement one another. It's not either or. This is Mi'kma'ki, but it's also the Maritimes. And it's in Canada, also known as Turtle Island. It's both simultaneously. Our contexts are valid and can actually complement colonial knowledge and strengths, but we have to be seen as allies and not wards of the state. We have to be acknowledged as benefits to this country and not detriments. Even now, many of you have your biases showing. I say this half lightheartedly, but also with a grain of truth. You're listening to what I have to say because I am a disarming shade of brown. I look enough and sound enough like you that I'm not threatening in what I have to say. And that's okay because you are the product of your society. But to be a good ally is always important to check in with yourself. Now I'm going to leave this talk on one final poem. It's called Eduuptamunk, or Two-Eyed Seeing. The concept was coined by Elder Albert Marshall in Eskasoni. Two-eyed seeing takes the strength of an Indigenous world and the strengths of a colonized world and asks the user to see through both contexts simultaneously. It has been adopted by organizations across the country who are interested in transcultural collaboration. Two-eyed seeing implies a responsibility for reciprocity, mutual accountability, and co-learning. It's what we built our treaties on. Perhaps when it comes to identity, reconciliation, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the many other things Indigenous people are navigating right now, mutual accountability and co-learning might go a long way. After all, as Elder Marshall says, the foundational basis of any relationship is an exchange of stories. And to quote the great Mi'kmaq poet Rita Joe, "So gently I offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me." And I will begin my next poem with the title of that piece. "I lost my talk," said Rita Joe. "For me, I was never given the option to know, to feel the flow of the words as they rolled off my tongue, giving me the lyrics of how our world was sung. My perspective was spun using the threads of both your world and theirs, left to cobble together a spirit from rags and tears, painfully aware that I was different. Through hard work and determination, I found my Indigenous articulation. A compilation of two ways makes up the sum of me. You have two eyes, yet you only have one view. Your way is best, you would argue. Centuries of being in position to subdue those who would aspire. They say the sun never set on the British Empire, and because we recognize the hubris that defines that story, we have both a sunrise and a sunset in our territory. With my heart and eyes, I have a completely different view. The consequence of my skin comes in an entirely different hue. Don't you see, although you represent us, we think very differently than you, because we see the world not through one set of eyes, but through two. Thousands of years long, we were independent, proud, and strong. We belong to this earth the way power belongs to money and privilege to birth. We put our communities first. But then came the fleets, filled with those you would ironically define today as come from away, to invade every inch of our world, to pull the threads that would unfurl us, to catch the way you speak. But this is not a poem for the retelling of a one-sided history. Each of our world has their strengths. Yours is in power. It gets to eat its cake and define race. It has the ability to unapologetically take up space if societal progress is linear. This society is top tier, terra nullius, as though we were never here. It must be nice to be so confident. This society is ubiquitous, built on reified rubrics of tradition and rhetoric. Your notions of diversity are ad hoc in nature, an afterthought feature to an immovable structure. But this isn't a conviction, nor an acquittal. Just the voice coming from an eye trained to be critical, who does not shy away from the opportunity to be political. And if you push both sides of our Venn diagram together, you'll get our circle. We were never meant to be static. Like the rivers around us, we shift and change and remain dynamic. We bring something to the table that is able to change your worldview and show you what we are capable of, that a lot can come from a holistic concept of the earth. You are not a plague, nor we a curse or a problem in need of a solution. And we've got to rid ourselves of the spiritual dissolution, the dilution of our treaties, written to share this land. And I ask that you understand that we are the experts on what we need. Don't feed us your good intentions. Carefully laid apologies will not get you an historical exemption. We plan our actions for the next 7 generations, and we invite you to do the same. Open your other set of eyes. Recognize the pain you have caused. Take a pause. Start breathing. Welcome to the world of two-eyed seeing. For me, with regards to Canada's record on Indigenous people, the writing is on the wall. So can you see what I see? Thank you.